Okay, we've been given the signal. It's ready to start on a lovely, snowy, cold winter day. There's no better place to be than in the house of God, around the fireplace, coffee pot making noises, cookies on the table, studying the Word of God, right? Sorry, we don't have the fireplace, the coffee, or the cookies, but we have the Word of God, so that's more valuable anyhow, right? Okay, let's open with the word of prayer. Our gracious Father, once again, we just marvel at the matchlessness of yourself, your godness, just your wonderful person, your character. And so as we have the privilege of living in a country where we can still openly gather and freely study and challenge one another and be encouraged through the preaching of your word, we thank you, we praise you, and just thank you for bringing us here safely, and pray for others who are still en route that you will watch over them. Thank you for the Word of God that we can open and study and talk about and discuss. Thank you that you were willing to reveal yourself on these matters so that we would know the mind of God, and then we thank you that your Holy Spirit is at work in us as believers so that we can learn to think more like you, so that we can have the mind of Christ. So we ask for your help today. May Jesus Christ be praised, in whose wonderful name we pray. Amen. Okay, just a very, very quick review. This is week number 3, and if you're just coming in, be sure you get a handout there. This is week number 3 in our series on distinctive living in decadent times, the Bible's teaching on the moral obligations of God's people against the backdrop of pagan culture. Boy, Phil was really on a roll when he came up with that one, right? But that's a good delineation of what we're trying to do. So for the past couple of weeks and today, we are looking at kind of introducing it and looking at some Old Testament illustrations where we see God's people trying to have a distinctive lifestyle, not for the sake of just being weird or different, but for the sake of being more like representing God. And then, of course, we see how it clashes with everything that is around them. And especially last week, we looked, focused on the book of Deuteronomy, but also you could go to Leviticus, because basically for each of those Deuteronomy references, there are also Leviticus references where God was doing the same thing, because remember, Leviticus and Deuteronomy were written, Leviticus at Mount Sinai, Deuteronomy 40 years later, just before they entered the land, as God was preparing his people so they could live a godly life. So, Lord willing, today we're going to look at the book of Daniel, and then for the next 6 weeks, Pastor Phil will be jumping forward to the New Testament to remind us of the continuity, and that at any time in history, from the very beginning up until the present, God has always demanded his people to have a distinctive lifestyle and to live in a way that would indeed show forth the Lord's glories in the midst of a pagan culture. And if you weren't here for the past 2 weeks and you want a handout or anything, be sure and see me afterward. So, some questions just as food for thought. As we start, the question, of course, is how can I live in an alien environment that is hostile to my faith? Or we might say, since Christians are not anti-culture and anti-world, but are citizens of 2 kingdoms, an earthly kingdom and a heavenly kingdom, or a temporal kingdom and an eternal kingdom, how do we fit into this kingdom now without being swallowed up? Or where do we draw the line between being in the world but not of the world, to use the expressions of Jesus in John 17? Or as one writer says, when does conformity become compromise, and compromise collaboration, and collaboration betrayal? And that's a good thing to be challenged on, because it's a slippery slope where sometimes we say, well, yeah, I think I can go along with so-and-so. But by going along with it, we're actually compromising, and before we know it, we're collaborating with the enemy, and we've turned our back on the Lord. It's like we've said, I don't want people to know I'm a Christian. I want people to think that I think just like they do. So today we want to focus on this Old Testament book of Daniel, so you can turn there if you're not already there. And we want to see how God's people were challenged, or God's people are challenged, to live distinctively in decadent times. Now, when we think of the book of Daniel, I'm afraid we usually think of it basically along 2 lines, okay? Number one is we say, well, yeah, that's just a great book for children. You know, we have Daniel in the lion's den, and we have the 3 youths in the fiery furnace. So, I mean, these are great stories to tell children to fall asleep on, right? I mean, really, when you think of bedtime stories and you see it in a bedtime storybook for your children, you're saying, yeah, right. Tell my child, here's somebody who could have died by being burned in a fiery furnace. Okay, now, son, go to sleep. Just calm down. It's kind of like, duh, wait a minute. But sometimes I think we look at the book of Daniel just in that context, or we look at the book of Daniel as, well, yeah, that is a great book for our scholarly prophetic conference that's going to abound in speculation, and you can think of more than half of the book that basically is dealing with that great eschatological stuff. Well, actually, there is so much more to the book, and interwoven through all this is this question of how are God's people going to live in an alien environment? How are they going to respond to the worldly pressures? And basically, as we're going to see as we look through the examples in the book of Daniel, it's one of two ways, and this is basically true today, as we often say, there's no straddling the fence. It's either going to be compromise, where we simply, it might not be just a wholesale selling out of ourselves that nobody can tell any differences between us and the world, but we're just willing to compromise and be pretty much like the world, or else it's simply faithfulness, and we say, let the world laugh at me, let the world mock me. I'm going to do what's right so that they know I have a different allegiance than they do. I have a different master. And of course, as we've been saying in all of these, in each of these lessons the past couple of weeks, this is not something new. This is something that God's people faced from the Garden of Eden on, from when man sinned, and it's going to be something that is going to happen to the very end of life on this earth. There's going to be this tension. So, today we want to go to the book of Daniel, and as you see at the top of your sheet, I gave you a timeline so you would know that this is an official Sunday school class, where we see 6 tests in the book of Daniel that are centered on 3 different time periods. So let me quickly overview this, and then we'll come back and look at most of them, several of them in more detail. Okay, in chapters 1, 3, and 6. So across the top of the timeline there, you see chapter 1, then chapter 3, chapter 6. We have the time period of Daniel's time. Okay, so we're going back into the 600s, into the 500s. Okay, and if you drop a little bit below it, you see 1, 3, and 6, Babylonization. In other words, Daniel living in the Babylonian Empire. Babylonization was simply they were trying to get everybody to walk lockstep, if you will, with the Babylonian system. Remember, the Babylonian Empire was huge, and so all these war-conquered peoples who had all these different backgrounds and all these different gods, how are we going to unify them? Well, basically, shall we say, bring them under the Babylonian umbrella. If we can just get everybody to serve the Babylonian gods, or at least outwardly make it look like they're serving the Babylonian gods, they're going to show allegiance, and we don't need to worry about rebellions. Then in chapters 8 and 11, in chapter 8, where it says 8, 9 to 12, the first entry under 8, and then in chapter 11, 21 to 35, Antiochus' opposition. These 2 passages refer to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, those things that Daniel's going to be talking about were prophetic. In other words, they were down the road from Daniel. Daniel, remember, is in the 600s, 500s. This was happening in the 170s, 160s BC. And as you know, and we'll get into more detail on this, but just quick overview here. This was the time of the Seleucid ruler, in other words, the one who was ruling up in Syria, this man Antiochus IV, who desecrated the Jewish altar or the temple by offering swine. He saw himself as the manifestation of basically Zeus. That's why he called himself Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's the Greek word for manifest or manifestation. So he saw himself, if you will, as Zeus in their midst. And of course, he is the one who was going to try to cause the Jews to follow this policy of Hellenization. So you see the word then, secondly, Numbers 8 and 11, Hellenization. That is, bring everything into conformity to Greek civilization. the language, the culture, the customs, etc. Now, in one sense, it was, shall we say, a blessing that he spread the Greek language or caused it to be learned by an awful lot of people, because the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, okay? So we can thank God for the way he uses even, shall we say, unsaved people at times to do matchless things in spreading the gospel, getting the gospel all over the place. But the point here is Hellenization. You've got to basically kiss up to everything Greek, and if there's anything distinctive about you, we've got to obliterate it. We've got to do away with it. We've got to water it down because you are not being a good red, white, and blue, if those were their colors, Hellenist, okay? And then in chapter 7, 8, and 11, chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, if you drop down 8, 23 to 25, and Antichrist opposition, 11, 36 to 45, Antichrist opposition. Those are segments that are future to us. And this is when the Antichrist himself will take center stage. And of course, we can better grasp some of what that future is going to be like by simply looking back at Antiochus IV Epiphanes and what he did, because the Bible presents him as a type or a pattern, if you will, of the coming Antichrist. Now, as John told us in 1 John, there are already antichrists on the scene. In other words, there are a lot of people who are really promoting anti-Christian stuff. But eventually, this is all going to be headed up in this one individual that the Bible talks about as Antichrist. So I have called that time period basically, these are really profound titles, huh? Anti-Christianization. Okay? So the world is trying to Babylonize everybody. They're trying to Hellenize everybody. They're trying to anti-Christianize everybody. Or the fourth thing I put there, as we think of this more in light of maybe, shall we say, today, is simply this term secularization. Or another term that you hear a lot about today is the term secular humanism, which is basically the same. And so, I mean, in one sense, you might say, yeah, we live in an anti-Christian environment. That's the pressure. You can say we live in a secular humanist environment, etc. It's pretty much all in the same. But I'm just trying to remind us, as I said, that this is simply the constant clash, if you will, or the constant struggle that God's people are going to have as we try to live in this alien environment. How can we have a testimony for the Lord? So on your timeline, I put that there was a column there for the test, because there was a test in each of these examples in the book of Daniel. There is a test where God's person is going to be challenged to give up that which distinguishes him from the current culture. Okay? And then I also added a column there, issues, so we could basically see what was at stake, whether it was a distinctive eating custom, worship of another god, remove aspects of your religion so that basically your religion simply is what the common religion of the day is, etc., etc. Okay, that's a lot by way of introduction. You still with me here? We can move on. No questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions? Okay. Were you asking me at the board meeting what that phrase was? Oh, it was Peter. Okay, so did I get it right, Peter? Perfect? Okay. Okay, so let's move on then to in chapter 1. So if you're in Daniel chapter 1, and we want to look at this first example, and this is of Daniel and the three youths. And I mean, the whole chapter applies, but I specifically put like verses 3 through 8. Now, the account is very terse, so there are a lot of things when you read a chapter like this that you say, wow, I wish God would have given us more information. And then on the other hand, you say, well, thank God he didn't clutter it with a lot of other stuff that would maybe water it down and cause us to say, well, that really doesn't apply to me, blah, 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 as we look for excuses. But this is the account of Daniel and his three friends who were taken captive by the Babylonians in 605 BC when they attacked Jerusalem. So again, just remember our map here. Last week when we talked about Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years. They came out of Egypt. They went down here to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God revealed the things in Leviticus. They came up into the land. Because of unfaithfulness, they wandered. Finally, they were here. Deuteronomy was written here. They're ready to go in the land. That was 1406 BC. So a lot of time has passed, and Babylon, the empire was over here, okay? Babylon was now going to be used as an agent of God to judge this southern kingdom because they had not faithfully obeyed what God said in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc. In other words, they had sinned. They had become idolatrous. They had become just like the nations that God had vomited out when He brought them into the land. And so what we're talking about with Daniel here was in 605 is when the first Babylonian invasion came in there, and Daniel and these three boys, and of course there were a lot of others too who were taken captive. And just by way of remembrance, 605, there was a second deportation in 597, and then a third one in 586, okay? But for Daniel, he was now taken in the 605 deportation to Babylon. From all indications, when we piece things together in the book of Daniel, etc., he and these other three boys would have been teenagers. Some make them pretty young teenagers, like maybe 13. Others calculate a little different and say, no, probably closer to 18, whatever. But that's no big deal. But it is a big deal, I think, to note that they were teenagers. We're not talking about some guy who's 27, been through undergrad and graduate school, seminary, and all this training to stand up and whatever. No, these are still guys very, very formative. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. He was looking for, shall we say, sharp captives who could be part of his, shall we simply call it, pilot project to train them in the language and literature. In other words, the total training, if you will, of the Babylonian system. And as I put on your sheet, this probably would have included the Akkadian language, literary material, math, astronomy, business matters, and the interpretation of dreams. Okay? So Daniel and these three friends of his, they are being, shall we say, test-cased so that they can really buy into Babylonization, and they will be good servants of the kingdom, good stewards, if you will, passing along this stuff. So the issue is this distinctive eating custom of eating the king's meat and drinking the king's wine. Now, verse 8 is really the key. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested that he might not defile himself. Now, because of this word defile, we realize that the exact nature of this test has to do with a religious test, or shall we say, a spiritual, it has spiritual implications to it. And Daniel simply said, by doing this, eating the king's meat, drinking the king's wine, I would be displeasing God. I would somehow be betraying God. And of course, the big question here is, because this sounds pretty simple to us, right? I mean, wow, you're in this pilot program. What does it hurt to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine? Why is that such a big deal? And so here is where we wish God would have added a couple more verses or sentences and said very explicitly, this is exactly what the point is. But we don't have it, and I think, again, as you've heard me say multiple times, I think sometimes God's Word, dare I say, God is nebulous when He wrote, because by nailing it down, we would have easily said, well, yeah, that applied to him, but what does that have to do in 21st century America? But by keeping it this way, God is reminding us of basically, are we willing to wrestle with some of these things and always having a absolutely do this, absolutely do not do that? Are we willing to give God the benefit of the doubt at times on things? Just like, and I'll probably use this illustration a little later too, when we raise our children, have we given, as our children are being raised, do we give them absolutely every positive thing to do and absolutely every negative thing not to do? I hope not. Okay, I hope your refrigerator isn't plastered with that much stuff on it. But rather, we're trying to teach them basic principles, and then as they grow up and they put two and two together and they make a decision on something that you hadn't even told them was right or you hadn't told them it was wrong, but they do it on their own, what do you do as a parent say? "Aw, shucks, my child did what was right and I didn't even tell him that was right." I hope you don't. But you say, "Yeah, chalk that up for Mom or Dad. We got through to them. They learned it and we didn't even tell them that was an explicit thing." And I'm convinced as we read the Bible, that's the way God is with us. Because He could have laid out 1,000,000,001 or more, 1,000,000,002 things, don't, do. But instead He says, I'm just going to give you the basic outline, the basic framework, so you know what my mind is. And as you walk with me and you want to represent me, you will have discernment and you will be able to decide what is right, what is wrong, etc. So, that was kind of an aside, but I won't charge you extra for it, okay? But you get the point? You see how we try and do the same thing? Well, I think that's what God is doing here. But what are generally there are three possible ways that this is interpreted. You see them on your sheet there, A, B, and C. Some say the food had been offered to idols and was unclean. Okay, and that's very possible. By being offered to idols, it was actually like by eating of this food that had been offered to idols, or the leftovers would be offered to idols, it would have been like he was sacrificing. Secondly, Jewish dietary laws would have been broken because the Babylonians, of course, didn't make a distinction between clean and unclean. And this goes back to the whole subject of, well, what about those Jewish dietary clean and unclean animals? And it's very possible that one of the explanations for it is simply God wanted them to follow it because He said, you are a distinct people. And even though there was nothing wrong per se with eating certain of those things, even though some surely do seem abominable if they were on your plate and you had to eat them, okay? But it could be God just said, I'm just going to say some of these things are taboo just so that you will be distinct when you eat. And people will know you are a Jew and you're not a Babylonian, Assyrian, Syrian, whatever. Okay? So those are good possibilities where they're simply where it had to do with those things. Or possible, C, the food had covenantal significance. By partaking of the king's meal, he was committing himself to the king's program. Okay? So in other words, if he would have eaten this meat, he would have in effect been saying, my allegiance is to the king. By participating in doing this, I'm showing that my allegiance is first and foremost to the king and not to my God. Okay? But whichever one you hold, and there's no need for us to debate them and waste time on that, because I think they're all pretty good, and they all, you could shoot a couple of holes probably in each one if you wanted to. But I think that basically we get the gist here of what's going on. Okay? So, I think an important thing to note in context is Daniel and his three friends were willing to cooperate as far as they could. Okay? This is not just some brash teenager who says, who are you? You're not an authority figure in my life. No. Bob's laughing because he knows what that's like on a daily basis in school, teaching. I mean, they could have had that kind of an attitude. All sorts of things, but they said, okay, we're willing to be educated in your system. We're willing to learn all these things that you're teaching other Babylonian students. Number two, they even accepted Babylonian names. Now, the Hebrew names they had are all theophoric names. In other words, they bear a name, or they bear one of the names of God. So in other words, when a name ends in L, who do you think the L refers to? God. So Daniel simply means my judge is God. Okay? And when names end in IAH, guess what divine name it's talking about? Phil? Yahweh. Okay? Yahweh, IAH. And so each of these names that they had were good Hebrew names tied in with one of the names for God. But now when the king said, or when the authority said, we're going to rename you, basically the names all had to do with Babylonian deities or with Babylonian worship. And again, depending on who you read, you're going to find slight differences because they're it is pretty difficult here. But like Belteshazzar, do you see any Babylonian god in that name, Belteshazzar? Bel, B-E-L. That was a Babylonian deity. Okay? The word Abednego, A-B-E-D, coming over into Hebrew, was actually Kebed, which is the word for a servant or a slave, and the N-E-G-O is probably N-E-B-O, which is the slave of Nebo, a Babylonian deity. And so really the Babylonian authorities, by changing their name, shall we say, so every time they called them, they were not associating them with the Jews and Yahweh, the real God. They were associating them with Babylonian deities and Babylonian aspects of worship. But we don't find Daniel saying, hey, you're using the wrong pronoun to refer to me. You change that or I'm out of here. Wait a minute, that sounds too up to date, doesn't it? But he said, okay, if you want to change my name to the Babylonian name, okay, I'll live with that. That's not a hill that we're going to die on. But, he said, we've purposed in our hearts that we are not going to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine. And they were saying as well that we're willing to suffer the consequences if we're found that when you allow us to eat our own diet, if there's a problem, we're willing to suffer whatever consequences you want to bring, because at the end of verse 13 he said, put us to the test, and then if indeed our countenance is looked upon, and the countenance of the children who eat the portions of the king's meat, and as you see, deal with us. So if at the end of this time you look at us and say, wow, this is bad news for you, you're not going to be the kind of person we want you to be, so therefore, we're going to have to punish you for it. They didn't say, but we're not willing to do the consequences. You're going to be in trouble if you try that trick. No. They just said, we're willing to take your test. And if we, shall we say, lose the test, we'll take the consequences for it, because we are going to be faithful to God. And of course, you know the whole story, etc., how the Lord blessed. And so at the very bottom there, I put this pattern that we see recurring over and over. They had faith in God. They believed that God honored obedience. They believed that God would vindicate them. But remember, when God vindicates us, it's not always the way we think. Think how many martyrs throughout history have died. Did God vindicate them, or did God lose? No. He said, my will is there can be a greater testimony by having you executed for your faith and obedience than by delivering you miraculously. But thankfully here in the case of the three of Daniel and the three youths, they were delivered. Okay? So that's the first great example we have here of trying to live distinctively, trying to have a testimony for God even in the midst of decadence. Okay, example 2, if you want to turn over to chapter 3, and again, for time constraints and because you're real familiar with these stories, I'm not reading most of these texts, but again, it's the whole chapter, but in verses 1 to 7 is where the gist comes in, if you will. The test revolves around worshiping this huge image, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, and if the cubit was 18 inches, which appears to be basically what it was. We're talking about 90 feet high and 9 feet wide at the base. So we're talking about an imposing statue that has been erected. And of course, this could have been a statue of like Nebuchadnezzar himself, or it could have been a deity, and of course he's the representative of the deity. So I mean, it's pretty much saying Nebuchadnezzar is God right here before you. Now, there are a lot of unanswered questions as we read this chapter again, but I think 3:2 makes it very evident what's going on. Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. In other words, he's trying to universally get everybody in his kingdom to come and acknowledge that he really is deity, or he is the manifestation of deity at that particular time. And I say that noting also, and I put on your sheet all these references, note the key words worship and also the key words serve or servant. Okay, so for example, chapter 3 and verse 5, he says, "At what time you hear the sound of all these musical instruments, you fall down and worship the golden image." Verse 6, "And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth," etc. So as you go through this whole thing, it's very evident this is meant to be an act of worship. Okay, and then the servant bit in verse 12. When they came to accuse Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, "These men have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image." So what we have here is really, whose servant are they going to be? Because as the story ends, it's very interesting. This word servant occurs, saying that Daniel served his God, and that these boys served their God, that they are servants of Yahweh. They're not servants of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's really the whole issue. That's what they're arguing about here, if you will. So we have this clash. Is God worthy of our sole allegiance, or will God brook rivals? Does God say, well, it's okay to have 4 different allegiances, just make sure that mine is always, one stepladder step higher than other allegiances? Or does God say, there are no other allegiances. Your allegiance is first and foremost and primary and only to me. Everything else is simply an idol. And somehow these boys understood that. They realized the implications of falling down even to a lifeless image. Kind of reminds me of during the days of the Roman Empire, when basically seems like there were times when pretty much they wanted all Roman citizens to simply come and, if you will, just offer a pinch of incense to the Roman deity, to the emperor. And all you needed to do is do that once a year, and then go home and live your life the way you want the rest of the year. But just once a year acknowledge that really he is Caesar, he's Lord. And there were people who went to the stake saying, I can't even do that once a year. I can't even fake it. I can't even bow down to the emperor and all the while be saying in my mind, but God, really you're allegiant, but I'm so valuable, I can't die. I can't be a martyr for you, so I'll just go through the rigmarole they want me to, and then I'll go home and live for you the rest of the year. There were people who said, no, that's a hill to die on, because my only allegiance is to God, and if I'm watering that down, I'm compromising. I'm being unfaithful to God. And that's really what these guys were doing. I mean, when you think of the simple thing they had to do, just go kiss up to the statue and then go on home and serve your God. He said, no. I would be acknowledging there's somebody in my life more important than God. There's an idol. There's an idol here. And so, of course, again, you see the pattern on your sheet. They trusted in God. They had faith in God. They obeyed God, and they trusted that He would vindicate them. Okay? And they accepted the consequences. Because, what is that verse where they said? Verse 17. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in the matter. That's not a flippant expression. They're simply saying, we will clearly answer you. We'll clearly give you our answer. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of your hand. But if not, be it known, we will not serve your gods nor worship the golden image. They said, our God is capable of delivering us, and if that's His will for us that He delivers us, then great. But if it's God's will that we not be delivered physically, that's okay. We're not going to compromise, and when the fires start getting a little too hot, we say, okay, turn it down, we've had enough. Yes, we'll kiss up to whatever you want us to. They said, no. If we're thrown in there and we're going to die, we're not going to change our mind. The word resolve doesn't occur, but basically it's the same thing as Daniel said. We have resolved that God is the only God, and we can't do anything. We can't do anything that would compromise it. Now, the Jewish boys realized this would have been a commandment of a violation of Commandment 1. What is Commandment 1? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Commandment 2. You shall not make unto you any graven images, the manner in which you worship it. And it's very possible that this would have been a violation of Commandment 3. What's Commandment 3? Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Now, the Hebrew word actually also means very commonly, you shall not lift up or bear the name of God in vain or to no purpose. And so it is very possible, and I put a reference for you there if you're really interested in checking out more. It's very possible that what that commandment means, I mean, it does still mean the same as we think of it, but actually it's even stronger in that if you bore the name of the Lord, you are saying, you are as we would say today, I am a Christian. And so by these boys bowing down to that, what they in effect were saying is, well, yeah, I've really entered into a covenant relationship with God to represent Him, but I'm willing to bow down here and act like I'm really serving your God. In other words, they would not be, they would be claiming to bear God's name, but at the same time, they would be living in disobedience to everything that name stood for. They were living no differently than their neighbors. And so they were saying, we can't do that. We have God's name, if you will, stamped on our forehead, saying, I belong to the Lord, and therefore we're bearers of that name, so we cannot violate it.
I always wonder where Daniel was during this.
Where Daniel was? He quickly took vacation in another country so he wouldn't have the pressure on him. No, that is a very interesting question, yeah. But when you read some of these examples, you get the idea. I mean, you very clearly see the point that they're picking on them, if you will. They're people who are watching them very closely to put them through these these tests. Okay, so again, chapter 3, all's well that ends well. It's great. These guys took a stand. God vindicated them. What a marvelous example it is for us. Daniel chapter 6, the issue here is worship. Remember, the large Persian Empire demanded efficient organization. That's understood. Daniel was one of these leaders, and he was doing such a good job, nobody could find fault with him. I mean, he obeyed the law of the land. His first allegiance was to God, etc. But I mean, as we know from other Bible passages, it's because he was faithful to God that he was so good at what he was doing. In other words, God blessed him with wisdom, with help, with everything he needed. And I mean, a Christian, all things being equal, a Christian ought to do a better job on his job than an unsaved person. And Daniel's just being faithful, nothing against him. But out of jealousy, as you know, these other leaders said, well, you know what, we need to trap him. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to somehow do it and show that the law of his God contradicts, and as we know, it was supposedly contradicts or conflicts with the law of the land. And so the king was basically, having been elevated to the status of deity, or at least representative of the deity, they make this decree that everyone has to worship this God, and by asking something from any other god, you were basically saying, my allegiance isn't to this God, I'm looking somewhere else for some help and direction. So as we probably would say, they were basically saying, everybody's got to kiss up to the state religion. Okay, and anything you do that makes it look like you are not one of us, that's divisiveness. You're causing too many problems. We can't have it. But in the case of Daniel, as you know, very interesting example, he simply continued his lifetime habit of worship and prayer. Okay? He simply said, well, all these years, and by this time he's probably a good 65, 70 years old, and he says, all these years I've simply faithfully served God, and He's watched over me, so I'm going to just keep worshiping God and praying. It's not violating anything, and I'm the best government employee, if you will, that there even is here. Now, when you think about it, again, this is just interesting, but when you think about it, think how easy it would have been for Daniel to just say, okay, you know what? This decree is only good for 30 days, so for 30 days I don't need to read my Bible. 30 days I don't need to pray. 30 days I don't need to do anything religious. And let's face it, I mean, after you've walked with God the decades he did, was he going to go in apostasy and fall off the table from just omitting anything religious for a month? No way. No way. He could have just justified it and said, well, even though I won't be caught reading the law, the passages I've memorized, I'll go through them in my mind, and God will be pleased with that. And I mean, all these, again, I'm just bringing up kind of excuses that we like to use, well, it's really okay to do this, no big deal. But he didn't look at it that way. He said, this is a big deal. I've always done this. I'm the best employee the government has, and you're saying I'm the cause of the problem, I'm divisive? Again, these things are no doubt going through his mind. We don't find him sassing back to him. He simply says, I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to walk with God. And he does, and of course, they get him for it, if you will, but the really interesting thing is as soon as the king realized what his decree meant and so forth, he was immediately apologetic. I mean, he realized he couldn't just change it for Daniel, but he immediately says, verse 16, the king commanded, they brought Daniel and cast him into the den, and the king spake and said, your God whom you serve continually will deliver you. Those are pretty amazing words from a pagan king, using the words serve and your God and deliverance. And then he went home, and the king sweated out while Daniel just had a nice, pleasant night petting kitties all night, if you will. Okay? I mean, this is just incredible what he did. So here we have this man targeted for his distinctiveness. He was not a rabble-rouser. He was not a peaceful demonstrator who was tearing down monuments to Babylonian history in the city square. Wait a minute, that sounds like today, huh? He never sought to overthrow the government by a coup or a militia-led assassination attempt. All he wanted to do was just serve God. And they said, but no, that's not good enough. And so he never committed a positive offense. He simply refused to stop doing a personal religious practice. Wow, it's pretty amazing again. Well, you see the pattern on the sheet. He had faith. He believed in God. He said, I'm going to trust God. I'll obey God. He trusted God to vindicate him. And I put the word accept consequences in parentheses because we don't specifically have him saying something like we find in Daniel 1 or in Daniel 3. But yet, by virtue of the fact that he didn't argue with them and it was just, okay, if you're going to throw me in there, then I accept the consequences for not obeying what you call a rule. So again, marvelous how God worked, and in this particular case, God was pleased to vindicate him in the sense of actually delivering him. And of course, you know how the story ends, where an incredible testimony, where even the pagans said, this God of Daniel, he's not in left field. He's over the whole field. He's over everything. He's the God. He's the one you ought to be serving. Amazing how God worked. And of course, these credentials, if you will, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, led them to be members of the Hall of Fame of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, where it specifically says, they stopped the mouths of lions by their faith. They quenched the violence of fire by having faith in God. But in the very same context, it's interesting because it goes on, it says, but there are those who were stoned to death and were sawn in half, etc. They also have faith. They also believed God would vindicate them. But in their case, the vindication didn't come by a physical deliverance. The vindication came as God used their testimony. So, marvelous stuff to think on. Now, one more quick example here. Not quite as familiar, maybe. So this is now going future to Daniel, okay? In 8, 9 to 12, and 11, 21 to 35, this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The test here is a distinctive religious practice having to do with the Jews' sacrificial system, their laws, the temple, etc. So a quick review of the setting. Remember, in 323 BC is when Alexander the Great died, and his empire was divided into amongst 4 of his generals because he didn't really have an heir to follow him per se. 2 of them, two of the generals who got it aren't really big deal at all in biblical history, but two of them are. One of them was getting this area down here in Egypt, and that is called the Ptolemies, so the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic dynasty, and the other one got his territory more up here in the area of Syria, and this is called the Seleucid dynasty. Okay? And so for about 175 years after 323 BC, these two dynasties, if you will, were in control of Palestine, and it was kind of a back and forth power play. In the early years, it was more the Ptolemaic dynasty out of Egypt that controlled here, and then in the later years, it was the Seleucid dynasty in the area of Syria, even modern-day Syria, that was in control, trying to dictate things with Israel. Now, all this time, because remember, what is Alexander the Great known for? I mean, yes, his speedy, great conquest, but he's known for Greek language, literature, everything Greek, Hellenization. Okay? So his generals naturally saying, if we're going to keep our portion of the pie succumbed or keep them under our thumb, we're going to have to really promote Hellenization as well. Well, down here, the Ptolemies were much, much more lenient or tolerant. However, the Seleucids pretty much were, no, you're going to be under our thumb. And this guy by the name of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, okay, he took it to an extreme. I mean, it's like he said, boy, I am on Hellenism with steroids. In other words, you are really going to come under my thumb, and you really will kiss up to everything Greek or else. Okay? And so he was ruling from about 175 to 163 BC. Okay? And so he is the one that some of his enemies gave him the epithet, instead of Epiphanes, a manifestation of deity, they said, no, you're Antiochus IV Epimanes. Sounds almost the same, which means the madman. I mean, you are out of your mind. And so what did he do? Well, as you see on your sheet, everything distinctive to the Jews, he says, we've got to do away with. In other words, ceremonial food regulations were condemned. Circumcision was banned. Reading of the law banned. Observance of sacrifices and festivals banned. And he's the one who then in 168 or 167 BC went into the temple in Jerusalem and desecrated it by offering swine on the altar, etc. Okay? So, I mean, this is a really difficult time for God's people. Am I going to stand up for this, or am I just going to kind of kiss up to it and say, I'll just go along with it and hope he dies before I do, and hope my children and grandchildren don't buy into all this stuff? Well, it was a difficult time, and I actually brought along the Apocrypha with me to read some passages from Maccabees, so you could read some historical accounts of what he did, and then you could read historical accounts how there were people who said, we will not go along with you, and they died for it. He killed them. And there were others who gladly threw in the towel and said, okay, if that's what you say, we'll go along with Hellenism because our life means more to us than anything else. But for sake of time, I think I'm going to omit that. And so, as you know, in either 165 or 164 BC, this is when this man named Mattathias, along with his 5 sons, led what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And the most famous of his sons was, of course, Judas Maccabeus. The word Maccabeus means the hammerer. Does that tell you anything about his prowess on the battlefield? And he, as well as the troops he gathered, were able to reclaim the temple. They came up with an agreement with Antiochus, reclaimed the temple, and of course, that became the basis for what even today is called the Festival of Lights or Dedication or Hanukkah. Okay? They cleansed the temple, etc. But the point we see here is, once again, this whole point of how were God's people going to respond? Were they going to simply stand up to Antiochus and say, we will not give up these distinctive Jewish practices because that would be betraying God? Or do we just say, our life means too much to us, we will do whatever you want us to do, it's not that big of a deal? So, very, very interesting examples here with these four, and then you can do the other one with Antichrist down the road in chapters 8 and 11, and you can explore those. Chapters 7, 8, and 11, and you can explore those on your own because they basically are going to follow the same pattern, even though it's future to us. You see how the Antichrist is going to say, I am God. Everybody has to do worship to me. I'm the one that calls the shots, and it could cost you your life if you will not obey me. Now, the top of the sheet then I put some application thinking as we begin to just, shall we say, think a little bit about, well, what about us, bringing this clearer or closer to home. And in the next 6 weeks, Pastor Phil is going to really start stepping on some of our toes because he's going to be looking at New Testament passages where it very distinctly says, this is how the pagan mind thinks, the unsaved mind. Here is what God's people, this is how you need to think now that your mind is being renewed by the Holy Spirit since you accepted Christ as your Savior. But as we begin to think about that, it seems like here, some of these illustrations we've seen in the Old Testament, when we think about ways that distinctive living is being challenged and the world tries to squeeze us into its mold, number one is simply disobey the outright commands from God. And I think of we haven't really spent any time talking about the 10 Commandments, although we could have spent time in this study, because when God says, here are the commandments, by obeying the commandments, we are having the mind of Christ and doing what He said. If we disobey them, we are saying, I don't want to be known as a follower of God in Christ. I want to think like the world does, and if the world says it's okay to sleep around, to lie, to cheat, to steal, whatever, I'll do it. So that's one way, and that's a pretty blatant way that hopefully most of us are pretty much able to see that kind of train coming down the pike, if you will, and say, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to obey God's explicit commands. But another way is we give in to things that associate us with worldly or pagan culture. Now, sometimes these things are not evil per se, but by participating in them, it can actually ruin our testimony for the Lord. And generally, it's not the kind of thing that we just, accidentally do. I mean, we've made a choice that, okay, I want to do this because I really don't want people to think I have a very good I don't want my testimony for the Lord to come across too strongly. And so we simply are willing to do it, and in the back of our mind, we probably justify it by saying, but there's no Bible verse that anybody can throw at me, because there's no Bible verse that says, thou shalt not do it. And yet in the back of our mind, we're saying, wait a minute, this is an association thing which definitely associates me with the way the world does stuff. And then a third way is sometimes the squeeze comes because the worldly way of thinking, in other words, the worldview of the world, causes them to make certain choices or to take certain positions, which the Bible calls idolatries. Okay? And this goes back, remember, to what we said in lesson number 1 as we talked about having the mind of Christ. It's a matter of, when we were unsaved, okay, and the devil, we were really plugged into him and we thought like he thought, there are certain principles, if you will, that simply are the bedrock of our life. And so when we make decisions to do things, here are going to be those various actions. Well, the Bible tells us that now that I am saved, I need to be developing this biblical worldview of what God says is right and true and the way to go, and then my actions will also be indicative of that very fact. And so my third illustration here is simply, even though we are a believer here, sometimes because we are so inundated with the principles that are lying at the foundation here, that they kind of sneak over into our life, and we look at people like this and maybe we say, well, you know what, they they think like that, and it doesn't seem to have any bad consequences for them now, so why wouldn't it be okay for me to do it? That's not that big a deal. But in reality, it's an idol. And some of them I listed there. As you read books on this, you'll find various books devoted to various ones of these. But it's things like the government is the answer. So where do I look for my ultimate help from birth to the grave? The government. Let the government do it. The government has the solution. And as you read the Old Testament, you see how many times God had to tell those people, no. God is the solution, not a government, not treaties with other nations, etc. Or what some writers simply call affluenza. Okay? And that's a terrible disease, easy for anybody to catch, okay? Which is simply he who dies with the most toys wins. Although actually that's not a true bumper sticker. The bumper sticker should say he who dies with the most toys still dies, okay? But if we buy into the world's way of looking at it, where there is no afterlife, this life is everything, you better get the getting while it's good, and then all of a sudden we can start making decisions over here as well, just as if we really don't believe there is a heaven to gain and a hell to shun. Or military. The military is the answer. Sex, hedonism, science, reason, narcissism. I mean, you name it, the whole thing goes on and on. But basically, again, thankfully, God has given us, shall we say, basic principles, representative samples, so that we can see the pitfalls and dangers in all of these. And yet, He's expecting us to put two and two together, going back to that earlier illustration today, where as His children, as we grow up in Him, He is simply expecting us to take those little tidbits He's given us, if you will, and say, well, you know what? There's no verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not do this, but it wouldn't be honoring to God for me to do it, because people would think I'm thinking like people over here, and I don't want that to happen. And so I'm not going to do it. And as God sees that happen, I can't help but believe that He just, says, yes, my children are getting it. They really do want to obey me, even when I don't give them explicit things. So as we think about our current 21st century context, with so many fruits, in other words, you look at all these fruits up here, all these perversions that are going on, just incredible. And the question comes back, well, where in the world, or what are the roots of those things? In other words, what led to this kind of fruit being produced? And as I put on your sheet, and again, this is books, volumes written on it, a lot of scholars simply say, well, it actually goes back to the age of the Enlightenment. So we're talking about the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, where the seeds were sown that now we are really beginning to reap the fruit of it. We're really beginning to pluck the errors of what they sowed. And so on your sheet there, it's kind of summarizing that. I refer to Immanuel Kant's magazine article, What is Enlightenment? He said, enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Self-incurred is the tutelage when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Sapere aude, have courage to use your own reason, or dare to be wise. That, he says, is the motto of the Enlightenment. So you see what he's saying? He's saying that if you look outside you, now remember, as a believer, where do we look outside us for direction in life? The Bible, God, what God has revealed. And he says, you need to grow up. You need to put aside all that stuff, and you need to be a man, be a woman, and think for yourself. You've got a head on your shoulders. You can reason. And we see what happens when men use the head on their shoulders and reason, and they're plugged into the devil. And all of a sudden you get this. So some of the keys that you see there on your sheet are anti-supernatural, which simply means supernatural things can't be explained rationally. But this isn't just doing away with the miracles in the Bible. Such a thing as salvation Can you put your hand on a salvation meter and it starts blinking green? Yep, Royce is really saved because it's blinking green. No, you can't prove that. You just say, I'm saved, but it's supernatural to them. Things like resurrection. How do you prove a resurrection? You have a Christian funeral, and while you're at the cemetery and they're covering the grave, all of a sudden you see the person going, no. What about heaven? How do you prove heaven? Oh, well, last week I had a few days, so I took SpaceX and went up there, and man, heaven, no. So in other words, you throw out anything supernatural. Can't be proved apart from reason. And then it's also, as it says, anti-revelation. We don't need an outside source because we can use our mind to understand things. Anti-church. Here, of course, they were basically against the Roman Catholic Church because the Roman Catholic Church has that neat Latin phrase, bringing it into English, there is no salvation outside the church, meaning outside the Roman Catholic Church. So they were saying, I don't need to be a part of an organized body of religion. And then anti-God, a bias against an authority figure. We don't need some God here to tell us how to behave. We're enough of a man. We're enough of a woman. We have ourselves. And all of a sudden, you begin to see how you can have such fruits today. Well, I wish we had more time to read the whole last section there on the Humanist Manifesto too, but again, apologize. I guess I got too wordy. You're going to have to go home and do it. But these are actually the words from the Humanist Manifesto 2, and then they are from a document that the Humanist Association produced to explain what their worldview really is. And when you read this, I gave you the snippets so you didn't have to go through a lot of deep stuff. I gave you the snippets where they simply tell you, like for example, Humanist Manifesto 2 begins by saying, as non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. So right there, they are telling you God is not at the foundation of our way of thinking. Science affirms the human species is an emergence from natural evolutionary forces. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. What does autonomous mean? I'm my own law, self-law. Really? Does that sound like what we see here as one of the roots bearing fruit? You bet. What does situation ethics mean? It means there is no absolute ethic. The situation will determine how you are going to act at that particular time. So as the chief proponent of this, the guy who really popularized it, said, there are times when you cheat on your wife and it's the most loving thing you can do in your marriage relationship. There are times when you kill people. It's the most loving thing you can do for someone. And right on down the line. That's pretty radical stuff, isn't it? But then again, you look at what we see up here as our fruits today, and we say, if that really is the root of your thinking, in one sense, it's like, wow, God is doing incredible things holding back evil. Because why isn't there even more evil that we're seeing when people think that way? And you can go through and read the rest of them. But I'll conclude there on a positive note by simply saying it's really great to consider the example of Daniel in the book. Look at his character. A teenager away from home, a pagan culture, sinning would have been easy, and no mom or grandma probably there to call him on the carpet for it. He said, no, that's not the kind of person I am. Look at his faith and trust. He believed God was sovereign, and Daniel's times were in the hands of God. Faithfulness. He knew God asked people to obey him, and so he said, if I honor God, God will honor me. Testimony. The overall picture you get from the book, more than 6 decades of description of his life, is that he was indeed an incredible testimony for God. He wasn't rude. He wasn't boorish. He didn't say, well, you can do that to me, but look what my God's going to do to you. No. He simply said, this is what's at stake. This is what God has said. I'm going to obey God, and God can do with me what he wants to do because I am in his hands. And so that wonderful child song, Dare to be a Daniel, is a song that probably as adults we ought to sing every morning when we look in the mirror as we get up. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. Okay, Phil, you want to come up here and I'll pass the football to you or hand it to you, so I don't want you to fumble it now. You have the next 6 weeks. Okay, Lord bless you. You've got 26 and 3/4 minutes.